back to the third lecture in Module 4. In the fourth module, we're talking about measuring departmental productivity and instructional cost. In Part 1, we looked at how do you measure productivity. In Part 2, we looked at how do you measure costs and what are the important productivity to cost ratios. And in this third part, we're going to talk about what we've learned from productivity studies generally, but especially from the most important productivity study that has been done in recent years called the Delaware study. So we've covered a lot of ground, and we're going to focus in this one on productivity. People have spent a lot of time paying attention to academic productivity, and a guy who pulled it all together is a guy named Michael Middaugh at the University of Delaware. He's now retired, but he started the Delaware study in the 1990s. He got fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education grant, or a FIPSE grant, to launch this study, which was the first of its kind to look at academic productivity or instructional productivity and costs across colleges and universities all over the country. A lot of universities signed on for this. It was not just a FIPSE grant, which is a Department of Ed grant, but there was also some private funding for it. It became a very well-funded study, and it attracted the notice of higher education all over the country. So it's a fairly big deal. It continues to this day. When Middaugh retired, and the funding has largely gone away, it's now self-funded. It is not quite as big a deal now as it used to be, but it's a historically important study, the first of its kind, and it's told us a lot about the nature of cost per credit hour across programs and universities. At this point, we've got data from well over 400 schools, and you'll find that there are important consortia that participate in it. HEADS is a higher education data sharing consortium of elite privates mostly on the East Coast. They regularly participate in it. And there are other consortia. CIC, Council for Independent Colleges, encourages people to participate. The Council for Christian Colleges and Universities has kind of promoted it somewhat over time, not a lot, but there are important consortia of schools that do participate. To do a Delaware study on your campus is quite time-consuming, and if you are a tiny private, it's likely that your school has not been part of the Delaware study. It is expensive to do the work in terms of personnel time, and if a college or university is understaffed and not already doing productivity analysis, it's not likely that that school would participate in the Delaware study. And so what we find from the Delaware study is probably skewed based on wealthier schools and state universities. Every research study has flaws to it, and one of the, or at least in terms of generalizability, and the generalizability flaw in the Delaware study is that it's probably not going to tell you a lot about the underfunded institutions across the country. But let's talk briefly about what we found from the studies. First of all, and I think this is the most important finding, is that costs vary widely by discipline within institutions. If you look across large Research 1 institutions and small private institutions, you're going to see vastly different costs per credit hour, but you will see a very similar pattern in that science, engineering, and business programs are always more expensive than humanities programs. The STEM fields are expensive programs to operate, and that is true within any institution across the country. If science and engineering is funded appropriately, it's going to be a lot more expensive than English, history, or philosophy. This is intuitive. You would expect that. What is important to know is that a program in a school may be really expensive just because of structural issues, right? If it's always the case at University of Minnesota, Macalester, University of Northwestern, Bethel, and Crown, that science is always more expensive, you know that there's something structural about delivering instruction in those disciplines. So expensive programs may simply have higher operational costs. It's not a function of mismanagement. To really understand if a department is too expensive on a campus, you really need to know by looking at data from similar programs at other similarly sized schools with similar budgets. So you can't just look at cost per credit hour within Bethel to know if you're paying too much to teach chemistry. You've got to know what does it cost to teach chemistry at Seattle Pacific University and Messiah College and other similarly sized, similarly structured institutions across the country. It's only then that you can understand, are you underfunding or overfunding that program relative to other programs in your university? Second factor that came out, or a second finding that came out from the Delaware study, is that personnel costs are the vast majority of the instructional cost. Personnel costs typically make up 90% or more of total instructional costs. That will vary, that percentage will vary by program. So instructional costs make up slightly less cost in a science field and slightly more cost in a business department or a history department. Why is that? Think about it for a minute. It's because of the technology that's required to teach science. That will be factored into the expense budget in the department. Personnel costs are slightly lower in terms of total cost in a science department. So any factor that drives up personnel costs will drive up instructional costs. How long faculty have been in a department drives up instructional cost. This is all intuitive, right? The longer a faculty member has been in a department, the more you're paying that faculty member. The more you pay the faculty member, the more expensive it is to deliver education in that program. This is one reason why board members don't love tenure, because tenure can guarantee that a faculty member can be there forever and ever and ever, in spite of maybe not being a wonderful faculty member. This is at least the narrative that you'll hear from some board members. And they intuitively understand that you pay longer serving faculty more, that drives up costs, and it may not drive up quality. You also know, of course, that the percent of full-time versus the percent of adjunct faculty members drive up cost. And that's why we look in productivity studies at FTE adjuncts and FTE full-time faculty. We want to know how much is really spent on supporting adjunct faculty in a program, because that drives down costs. And it's worthwhile to pay attention to that metric because, again, you can set institutional thresholds at which you say, we're no longer going to have adjuncts, we're going to hire a full-time faculty member. Another factor that drives up personnel costs is differential pay by discipline. I said earlier that science and business are usually the most expensive programs. The reason business is usually so expensive is not because of the technology required to teach business. It's because of the pay level that faculty and business departments get. Most universities across the country do provide differential pay by discipline. Small colleges often do not, but all Research One universities, as far as I can tell, have differential pay by discipline. So the business faculty, the engineering faculty get paid a lot, the law faculty get paid a lot, whereas the English faculty, the art faculty, the theater faculty don't get paid nearly as much. Differential pay by discipline may be evidence that cost disease affects some departments more than others. Think about how Baumol's cost disease works and reconstruct in your mind why I've concluded what I've concluded with this third bullet point here, that differential pay by discipline is evidence that cost disease affects some departments more than others. I'll leave that one up to you to think through more deeply. The third finding that emerged from the Delaware study is that teaching load is highly related to cost. All things being equal, the more faculty teach as opposed to doing research or administration or service, the less expensive any single class is. One way that colleges and universities are looking at right now to reduce cost is to pay very close attention to how much of faculty load is actually focused on teaching versus other things. If you can drive up teaching assignments within a faculty, you're going to drive down the cost to deliver any single course in a college or university. The book, The Innovative University, which came out a few years ago and was widely popular in terms of being discussed on campuses, that book focused on Brigham Young University in Idaho. Now, Brigham Young University has 3 campuses. The biggest one is in Salt Lake, but there's another campus in Hawaii and another one in Idaho. The focus of the innovative university was BYU Idaho. It was a campus that was really struggling, and they brought in the business dean from Harvard, who is a Mormon and felt a calling to come take the presidency on at that university. He did really pretty radical things. One of the things he did was to move to a 12-month teaching load for faculty. Another thing he did was to essentially cut out all administrative load and all research load from faculty assignments. So faculty went from 9-month assignments to 12-month assignments. They went from some time to do research and to do administrative assignments to almost no time to do those things. So they became teachers, essentially. When that president did that, he was able to get away with it, I think, because the campus was going to close otherwise, and also likely because there was such a strong sense of mission from faculty members who are required to be Mormon. So they're really committed to the mission of the institution, and they went along for the ride in their change of assignments. They got a little bit more pay. They got pay bumps for going to 12 months. Not a 33% pay bump or a 50% pay bump, but they did get I don't remember, 10 to 15% pay bump. But they also took on heavy teaching load. And when they did that, that really drove down the cost of instruction, and it helped that institution survive because the cost per credit hour dove by maximizing teaching assignments per faculty. Again, in an environment where there are very few resources in higher education and increasing competition and increasing likelihood of cutting budgets, one way that colleges and universities across the country are looking at saving costs is by increasing teaching load. You're going to rely on fewer adjunct faculty or fewer full-time faculty members by increasing teaching load, thereby driving down costs. A fourth finding coming out of the Delaware study is that class size is highly related to cost. The number of students taught per faculty member has a huge impact on cost. Now, really, that's the primary productivity ratio, right? Number of students taught per faculty member, student-faculty ratio. It's a primary measure of productivity. And the higher that ratio is, the less expensive it is to deliver education. Here's a complicated graph, but I think you'll understand it just fine. It's the impact of class size on the cost per credit hour and revenue after the direct cost. So the blue line is the cost per student credit hour based on class size. So if you have 10 students up to 20 students in a class, you can see that if you have only 10 students, the cost per credit hour to deliver instruction in this department is $400 per credit, per student credit. If you have an average class size of 20, the cost per student credit hour has dropped from $400 down to $200 per credit. Increasing class size has a huge impact in how much it costs to deliver education. Every empty seat in a classroom is a seat that costs. If you can fill that seat up with a tuition-paying student, you're driving down the cost of instruction per student. Just makes sense. What's really surprising is that revenue grows pretty dramatically in a course for every additional student that you add. And the golden line in this graph shows you how much revenue is being produced after you've paid for the professor to be in the classroom. With 10 students, that course is producing only $4,000. With 20 students, that course is producing not twice that amount, but more than 4 times $4,000. If you double the size of a class, you're more than quadrupling the income in that course after all the expenses are paid for. One of the things that is really important coming out of the Delaware study and the implications from the Delaware study is that academic leaders need to pay a lot of attention to average class size. If you can maximize average class size, you are helping to really drive up net revenue that helps you pay your people better. It helps keep people employed and secure, average class size is one of those basic metrics that you really need to pay attention to. If you can even increase average class size across all programs and all courses by one student, you'll feel the impact of that in the institution's bottom line very quickly. A key metric to pay attention to, therefore, is average class size. So some corollaries. Well, one of the corollaries is that upper division courses in graduate education is almost always going to be more expensive than lower division classes. Why is that? Because upper division courses are usually smaller. Students drop out, they major in other things, they get divided out, and so upper division courses are quite expensive relative to lower division courses. A 400 level course in a major is often 4 times more expensive, 5 times more expensive, 10 times more expensive than a 100 level course. And it's often the case that 100 level courses pay for 400 level courses in a department. Likewise, graduate education has average class sizes that are almost always smaller than undergraduate class sizes. Second, some departments based on tutorial models are always going to be really expensive. 2 of those are music and education. Music programs are notoriously expensive because of private lessons. And even if you ask students to pay for private lessons on top of tuition, it's almost never enough to fully recoup the cost that you're actually paying the faculty member to provide those lessons if that person's a full-time faculty member. Teacher education, mandated by most states to be small in terms of student-faculty ratio. Student teachers, it's a tutorial kind of model that they use. That makes teacher education programs very expensive in a college or university. Third corollary of the class size finding is that if you can figure out how to reward departments for exceeding average minimum enrollments per course, you can reward them for doing the right thing. How do you grow your average class size in a program? An easy way to do that is by cutting out courses. If you have fewer courses and the same number of students, you're going to have more students per course, all things being equal. If you tell a department, if you can drive down the cost per credit hour in your department by increasing average class size, we're going to let you have half of the money you save. That will help motivate a department chair to increase class size. I've found that by rewarding department chairs for doing the right thing, you're likely to get the right behavior from them. If you can use what you know about class size to reward faculty, you can actually help trim curricula without big fights. At least in an ideal environment, that's the case. So what have we learned from the Delaware study? Well, first of all, it's been a hugely important study across 400 or more institutions. Lots of consortia pay attention to the data that comes out of it. We know that because of the Delaware study, some types of programs are going to be expensive. Science and engineering is going to be inherently more expensive than history. We know that business is most likely to be much more expensive than art. That's across lots of different kinds of universities. One of the really interesting findings is that there's more variation in cost within a university across the programs than there is in the same kind of program across all universities. Departmental costs vary widely. Second, what drives up instructional cost? It's the cost of professors. They're 80 to 90% of the tuition cost per credit hour. Third, if you can find a way to increase class sizes, that is going to pay money to the bottom line at a university. And just by increasing an average of 1 or 2 students per class across all courses taught at a university can actually bring, depending on the size of the school, $1 million or more to the bottom line. It's a really important number. From this whole series of lectures on instructional productivity and instructional cost and the Delaware study, my conclusions are these. First, we need to pay attention to instructional productivity. We need to monitor teaching loads, FTE faculty. We need to monitor student credit hours, and we need to understand cost per credit hour. We need to make sure that productivity and cost data go to presidents, provosts, and deans, and occasionally board members might want to see productivity data and cost data. They should at least be informed that you're measuring these things and tracking them. It's important to look not just at single numbers, it's important to look across time. Usually we look at 3-year cycles or 4-year cycles or 5-year cycles in a department, so you're always paying attention to trends, and it's usually important to not focus on one department but across multiple departments. That's especially true with regard to measures of student credit hours and measures of FTE faculty. Make comparisons, don't look at isolated numbers. Fourth, when you are paying attention to instructional costs and you're trying to control costs, pay attention to that which you can control. You can control how many faculty you've got. You have some control over average class size. You have control over class size by scheduling classes the right way, by cutting out courses from requirements. You can therefore grow average class sizes. You can also pay attention to ratio of full-time to part-time faculty, something you can really control. And once you've measured that, you can talk about it in public with faculty and say, we're going to make it a requirement that before you get your next full-time faculty member, you must have at least 1.2 FTE adjuncts, for example, something like that. So that people understand the landscape in which they're operating, they understand that you're paying attention to the numbers, and you understand that you're being fair in the way that you evaluate those numbers because you're doing it consistently across programs. This series of lectures has been complicated. I know it's some of the most technical material that you've encountered in this course. I decided to go into the technical details because I want you to be able to understand when you're talking to deans and provosts what these measures are, what they might be talking about. I want you to know some factors that influence instructional costs. And I want you to understand that this is really a kind of a specialty that some people go into, and it's something that academic leadership should know, understand, pay attention to, and try to control because it so clearly impacts the bottom line for the university, which is really what this course is focused on. Thanks for being on this journey for 3 technical lectures, and this is the last of the lectures in this course. Been good to be with you. Take care.